Today we're going to be learning Yoma Daf Pei. Just a reminder, Siyum coming up. So either come join one in Israel, come to the Zoom in English on July 11th. All the registration details on the website. We hope to see you there, and you can even do both. I hope for those who are visiting in Israel for the summer will join one of the Siyums happening around. You're all invited to Ranana. I'll be at the one in Ranana, and you're invited to any other one that might be all around the country. Okay, we are starting our daf. Today's daf we'll be learning for a refuah shlema of Devar Shulamit Bat Yocheved Chana. Okay, starting from the bottom. Tanya Rebbe Omer, the very bottom of Ayin Tet Amud Bet, the last three words. We're now going to bring a brighter. Today's shiur mostly is going to deal with, as we started yesterday, the shiur, the requisite amount. We talked about how the requisite amount for Yom Kippur is different from the typical, from the kizayit, which normally we say an olive bulk. Here it's the size of a date with its pit. We had all discussion which one it was. Oh, and I wanted to correct. There was something I explained yesterday incorrectly. We had the whole discussion about that we figured out after class yesterday, where it said Trei kabe de chamre chad kabe de kashiata v'sriach. I explained incorrectly. I'm going to correct it now. We were talking, we weren't sure whether it was volume or weight. It's actually all volume. And what it means is I explained it wrong. Trei kabe de chamre, if you take 2 kav of dates, of those 2 kav, 1 cup and more is just the pits. And that's showing that the pits are larger than the dates itself, because if more than half of it is pits, obviously that means the pits are larger than the dates. Okay, so that's the explanation there. And that helps explain what we were talking about before, the possibility of saying that maybe the pits were larger than the dates. And that's why Kotevet Agasa is larger than 2 kotavot without the pits. Okay. So now we have Rebbe Omer. כל השיעורים כולם בכזית, חוץ מטומאת אוכלים, ששינה כתוב במשמען ושינו חכמים בשיעורן. I'm just going to read one more line and then I'll go back. וראיה לדבר יום הכיפורים. So first of all, you have this catchy phrase that Rebbe says, which is basically, right, often they did brighter in a catchy kind of way so that you remember it. Okay, it kind of rhymes. She everything except for tumat ochlin, or sorry, kol shiurim b'kazayit. Everything is kazayit except for one exception, even though there's more than one, obviously. But the one exception they say is tumat ochlin, which we'll talk about in a minute what that is. Shina katuv b'mashma'an v'shinu chachamim b'shiuran. You get it? It's a little bit of a catchy phrase. It means the Torah changed the wording. Instead of just saying simply don't eat, which it says by many things, right? Don't eat chelev, forbidden fats. Don't eat, right, non-kosher animals, or all sorts of things. Don't eat. When it came to impurity of foods, it said it in a strange manner. We don't know yet what the strange manner is. We're only going to see that in a few lines. And because the Torah says it in a bit of a different way, the rabbi said it must have a different requisite amount. Okay, Gita, you're pointing out, I thought I said this, but maybe I didn't, that the whole reason why it had this rhythm is so that people would memorize them, because most of them were not written down at that time. They were only written down later, and they were mostly passed down orally. So if you do it with a rhythm, people will remember. It's a mnemonic device. So now, if the Torah uses a different language, that's going to mean that the rabbi said, oh, from here we derive that the requisite amount required is different. And the proof, what kind of proof are we going to bring for this? Yom Kippurim. Because Yom Kippurim, what does it say? We're going to see in a minute. It says, Kol hanefesh asher lo te'uneh, any person who doesn't afflict themselves. It doesn't say who eats, right? It doesn't say it's forbidden to eat. It says affliction. Affliction doesn't appear anywhere else. That's a strange use. Because it's a strange use, that's why it's kotevet. Likewise, tumat ochlin is a different shiur, a different requisite amount. Before we move on, there's a few things I have to explain. Number one, what is tumat ochlin? What are we talking about? So tumat, and what's the shiur? We're going to learn it later, but the shiur is a kibetza, size of an egg. Now, what in tumat ochlin is the size of an egg? There's a big debate. Every time we see this, we talk about this debate. Tosfot says that this means both for food to become impure and for food to pass on impurity to other food. If I, for example, touch food, I'm tameh, let's say I'm an avatuma, I'm a nida. I touch food, I make it impure. If that's a rishon can make a sheni impure. Food can touch other food and make that other food impure. So there's 2 stages. One is for it to take on impurity, and the other is for it to pass on impurity. So everyone agrees that the shiur of a kibetza is for sure, in order for it to pass on impurity, it has to have a kibetza. If it's not a sizable object, it can't pass on impurity. That Tosfot agrees with, the Rambam agrees. But Tosfot adds on that the shiur for becoming tamei also, if I touch food, in order for it to become tamei, it has to have a size of a kibetza. If I touch a kazayit of food, it won't become impure. That's the big machloket. Is tumat ochlin also to become impure? So Tosfot says yes. Rambam says no. You don't need tumat ochlin to become impure. You don't need a kibetza, to become impure. Anything. If I touch any piece of food, I can make it impure. It just can't pass on impurity unless it has a kibetza. So that's tumat ochlin. So since the Torah said use different wording by tumat ochlin, therefore the rabbis instituted a different requisite amount. The next part before we move on is this line about shiru chachamim b'shiuran. Shinu chachamim b'shiuran. We're going to learn later on in the daf that all the shiurim, the requisite amounts, are halacha l'moshe misina. What's halacha l'moshe misina? It's not from the rabbis. It's a tradition passed down orally from Sinai. It's something in between rabbinic and Torah law. It has this strength, as if it's a very old tradition. So you can't say, how do you say that the rabbis determined, based on the strange verse, they determined that this would have a different requisite amount? The requisite amounts were determined halacha l'moshe misinai, which we're going to see later. So everybody asks this question. There's different answers given, but the question's a really good question. One of the answers given is the requisite amounts were passed down orally, but not which ones go with which. Like kibetza, kikotevet, kizayit. The question is which ones are kizayit, which ones are kotevet, which ones are, that the rabbis determine. That's one way of looking at it. Anyway, it's a good question. Different answers are given. Now the Gemara is going to ask a few questions on this line. First is, where in Yom Kippur that we brought this as a proof that when you change the wording, it means it's a different requisite amount. Where do we see this? Milo te'uneh. I already showed you that, so we know that already, because it doesn't say don't eat. It says, right, anyone who doesn't afflict themselves will get karet, will be cut off. There you see, it's different. So how is the shiur any different? That we already know, kikotevet, because I said the size of a date rather than the size of an olive. It's very strange, right? It says everything is kazayit except for tumat ochlin because the Torah used strange language there. How do we know that using strange language means a change of shiur? Well, we have proof from Yom Kippur, but you could just prove it from it itself. You don't need a proof from somewhere else. So they say, well, if we had learned it just from, right, like you would have expected it to say, since shina katuv in tumat ochlin, that's how we know it, and you would have expected them, let's say, to bring the verse there where it was different. Why do you need to bring in Yom Kippur as another example? It's just another example. It's not really proof, and why did you need that as proof? So they say if you just had tumat ochlin, hava amina orcha dikrahu, you might have thought it's just written in a normal way. In other words, the atypical nature of the verses is much more atypical when it comes to Yom Kippur than it is for tumat ochlin. We don't know yet because we don't know what verse they're using, but in a minute you'll see, or in a few seconds you'll see, and then you'll understand. Yom Kippur is clearly different because it doesn't use the term achila at all. It doesn't use food in the sentence. It talks about affliction. So what do they answer? So because of that, you might have thought that was just a regular use of the pasuk. That maybe it is kind of just the way, a manner of speaking, the one by tumat ochlin. Therefore, you need the Yom Kippur as proof. Tumat ochlin kibetza minalan. So where do we learn tumat ochlin kibetza? Amar Rabbi Avau, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Ta'amakra. Rabbi Avau says in the name of Rabbi Elazar, as the verse says, this is by tumat sheretz, a creepy crawler that has tumat. It says mikol ha'ochel asher ye'achel. Okay, this is, I'll read you the whole pasuk. From all the food that can be eaten, asher yavo alav mayim, if water got on it, this is what we talked about, hachsher lekabel tumah, shita, right, that it needs susceptible to impurity, yitma, v'chol mashkeh asher yishteh, v'chol kli yitma. Okay, this is a verse that basically says, it says any food that can be eaten. What do you mean? Food always can be eaten. You didn't need to say any food that can be eaten. So therefore, they learn from here that it must be, for food to become tamei, it must be an exception to the rule. But you could see why it's not as atypical, because maybe it's just a way of saying it, food that you eat, rather than, right, food that you don't eat. I don't know. So basically, because of that, they brought the Yom Kippur pasuk, because you wouldn't have necessarily known it. But anyway, that's not what they're talking about here. They're now just dealing with here. What is the verse? That's the verse. Now, how do you get from there a kibetza? So they say, this must be ochel haba machmat ochel. It's food that comes from food. Ve'ezeh, and what is that? Beitzah ternegolet, an egg, right? That comes from a chick, that comes from a hen, is an egg that comes from food. Right? The ternegolet can be eaten, and so can the egg. So kol ochel asher yachel. They learn from here. How do we get to a shiur of a kibetza? And it's not just that it's an atypical usage, but how do we get from there that the shiur is a kibetza? Because it's a reference to food that comes from food, and what could that possibly be? Only an egg. Okay, well, not necessarily. The Gemara is going to say, what do you mean? There's other foods that come from food. Ve'emagdi. Take any animal. An animal is born from another animal. That's food that comes from food. So they say, no. What does food mean? Food means something ready to eat. Now, when an animal is born, it's not ready to eat. It needs mechusar shchita. It needs slaughtering. That's not food. Food is something I can eat right now. You wouldn't call a gedi, an animal, a kid, something that I can eat right away. Ve'ema bempkua. Okay, wait. An animal, a normal animal needs shchita. But there's an exception to that rule. What's the exception to that rule? An animal that is a fetus of an animal. Let's say I slaughter the mother. There's a fetus inside. It's a very strange halacha. That fetus can be eaten without slaughtering. Okay, so let's say there's a few different examples, right? The fetus could die. It's just, what's the idea here? The idea here is that the fetus, when I slaughter an animal, all of the limbs can be eaten. I don't have to do anything to them in order to eat them. So they view the fetus as one of the limbs of the animal. So therefore, even if that animal, let's say it was the end of term, and the animal got up and started walking and was alive after I slaughtered its mother, I don't need to slaughter that animal. I can eat it without shchita. Fascinating halacha. Right? That you could take an animal and eat it without slaughtering. So they say, oh, you say it needs slaughtering, but I'll give you an example of something that doesn't need slaughtering, that's ready to eat, as is. Well, not exactly. So the Gemara is going to say, what do you mean? Ta'un kriyah. You can't eat the animal alive, you have to kill it. And even if, let's say, the fetus came out dead because you slaughtered the mother, maybe its supply got cut off, it died in the interim, you still can't eat it right away because you have to cut it up into pieces. It's a big animal. So either which way, that wouldn't fall into the criteria of food. Ve'ema beitza bar yochani. What about the beitza of bar yochani was known as this huge, gigantic bird, and its eggs were huge. There's in fact a very exaggerated story told about the egg from a yochani, that bar yochani, that fell and destroyed, like, I forget what it was, 300 cities and caused all this strange destruction. I was saying this last night in my house. Someone said, you're going to give me bad dreams thinking about this egg dropping down and destroying an entire city. But anyway, the egg of bar yochani, maybe, in other words, we say the size of an egg. What egg? We said the beitza of a ternegolet. Why a ternegolet? Any egg comes from another animal and is ready to eat right away, right? Comes from another bird, is ready to eat right away. So maybe it's this gigantic egg. So they say, tafasta meruba lo tafasta, tafasta muat tafasta. This is a very famous phrase that's used all the time in many other contexts, not necessarily this one, where sometimes it means don't try to do too much, right? Try to do what you do it well. Don't try to do, if you do too much, right, you won't do anything. Tafasta meruba lo tafasta. You try to grab too much, you might not get anything. So, right, like we say, listapek b'mu'at, be satisfied with less. And yes, it's used very much in modern Hebrew. But here it means if you have a choice between a large requisite amount or a small requisite amount, we're going to go with the smaller one. Okay. First of all, it's more stringent to go with the smaller one, right? Because we're going to say as soon as it has that small shiur, it's going to pass on impurities or become impure depending on which opinion. So they say that's why we don't go by the beitza of the bar yochani. But but now they ask another question. If you're going to say go by the smallest shiur, then what would you say? Let's take the beitza of a bird that's even smaller than a hen. So Rabbi Yava didei amal. So he's going to give a different explanation in the end. Mikola ochel asher ye'achel, which is ochel shata ochlo bevat achat. Any food that you eat means that you eat it once. How much can you fit in your mouth at once? They basically assess that the amount of food one can put in one's mouth at the same time it all at once is the size of an egg of a hen. And therefore, we're talking about an egg like that. That's the shiur. We end up giving this different reason. Amar Rabbi Elazar. And another, there's a lot of strange halachot in today's daf, I would say. Ochel chelev bizman hazeh. Let's go do some background. Chelev is the forbidden fats of behemot, specifically domesticated animals. It all comes from the fact that the chelev was burnt on the altar. That's how you remember that it's only behemot and not chayot, not undomesticated animals, because chayot were never brought as sacrifices, only behemot. Okay, the bulls, the goats, all those are in the behemat category. Since their chelev was burnt on the altar, we don't eat chelev anymore, right? We're not allowed, and not anymore, just in general. We're not allowed to eat chelev. It's kind of like on sacrifice that went to God, therefore in regular meat that we don't sacrifice, right? We can't eat the chelev. If you eat chelev unwittingly, you bring a korban chatat, but you have to eat how much? A kazayit, the requisite amount. If you ate, okay, now we're going to say the following. Once there's no longer a temple, what do? So now you'd say, okay, well, there's nothing we can do really because we don't have a korban chatat. But imagine you're living in the time after the destruction of the temple, and you believe, right, we also believe this, but it's harder for us to believe this because we're so many years after. But you imagine that Beit HaMikdash is going to be rebuilt in soon. So what are you going to do if you ate chelev? You're going to keep track because maybe I'll need to bring a sacrifice. As soon as the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, I'll bring a sacrifice. Okay, so Rabbi Elazar says, remember, he's living in Israel and he's living in the time of Rabbi Yochanan, okay, which is the first generation of Amoraim. I think he might be considered second generation of Amoraim. He was a student of Rabbi Yochanan, basically not so long after the destruction. So now he says, if you eat chelev nowadays, not only do you have to keep track of that you ate chelev, but how much you ate, what the size of the piece of forbidden fats that you ate was. In case a new court comes along and they determine the amount to be different. Now, we don't know, Yerbeh b'shiurim literally means they will make the requisite amounts greater. We don't exactly know what this means, but let's see. So, my Yerbeh b'shiurim, what does it mean, Yerbeh b'shiurim? If you want to say that it means that maybe right now I ate less than a kazayit, okay? But maybe later they'll determine that the size of an olive is actually smaller than it was now. And then it's going to turn out that even though I wasn't really liable for a korban at the time I did it, but now I'll be liable to bring a korban when they rebuild the temple and they've already determined that a kazayit is much smaller than they thought. And they'll change, right? We know this from Pesach, right? Sometimes people are careful to eat 2 kazaytim of Pesach because they say the shiurim changed and the rabbis determined that kazayit is really a different size than it was. Things change in terms of how they view requisite amounts because it was all dependent on things in their day and all different kinds of things. And over time, they do change these things. So because of that, maybe it'll turn out that you wouldn't, that according to the new definitions, you're liable to sacrifice. This is an interesting thing in law in general. If they change definitions and you did something previously, will you be liable for the new definition of the law? That seems very odd, right? It doesn't make sense because you had to have done it, right? Knowing it was a sin, really. It seems very weird, in which the Gemara is going to actually reject this. Notice it was introduced by inema, if you want to say, which usually ends in the Gemara with, it's not the case. The Hatanya, it says in a Braita, Asher lo te'asena bishkaga va'ashem. When do you bring a korban chatat? If you do something, bishkaga, unwittingly, and you're guilty. And they darshan this pasuk and they say, when you're liable, hashav miyadiato maybe korban al shigata. What happened was you didn't know it was chelev or you didn't know chelev was forbidden. As soon as you find out, it's called hashav miyadiato. You have to have a yidiyah. Know that what you did was forbidden. You find out later you knew. When you find out, you have to be shav miyadiato. You have to say, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. I never would have done that had I known it was asur. Or I never would have done it had I known that was chelev. That's when you bring a korban on your shkaga. But if you find out that you did something wrong and you could care less, you can't bring a korban chatat on that. So why is this a problem, right? Lo shav miyadiato. If you don't have any remorse about it and you don't feel bad about what you did, You can't bring a sacrifice. A sacrifice is connected to the fact that you want to atone for this. If at the moment you find out you don't want to repent at all, you don't care, right? Shav milashon tshuva. Apropos your question, Gita. Yes, tshuva. You want to do tshuva. You want to make up for this, and that's why you're bringing your korban. But if not, now, what's the yidiyah here? You found out you ate chelev, but you didn't eat a requisite amount. So you don't have to do repentance. It doesn't require repentance. Years later, they change. Now, what's going to require you to bring the korban now? The fact that the rabbis redefined what a kazayit is. That's not something you're liable a korban for. There's no remorse there. When you did it, it wasn't forbidden. This is kind of like the idea of ex post facto, that now we're going to take this old law and say what you did was wrong. It wasn't wrong then. So you're not liable to sacrifice for something like that. So it can't possibly be that that's what we're concerned about. What if now you ate it, it was kazayit? You did something wrong. You're liable a korban. But what happens? Later on, before the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, or when the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, the rabbis change what a kazayit is. So you write down, I ate a kazayit worth of chelev. That kazayit, years later, is not liable anymore for a korban. So you'll be exempt from a korban, because at this point, they've changed what a kazayit is and what makes you liable for a korban. So that's what it means, yarbeh b'shiurim. And actually, it makes a lot more sense. Yarbeh b'shiurim means yarbeh means harbe, great. They'll make the shiur larger, right? That makes a lot of sense. So now the Gemara goes back to the first one and says, wait a minute. The words, they suggested originally that maybe it means they make the shiur smaller, the requisite amount is smaller, and you'll be obligated. What is yarbeh b'shiurim? It should be, right, you make the shiur smaller, not larger. So they say, Shema yarbeh b'korbanot machmat shiurim. Maybe you'll have to bring more korbanot. The yarbeh is korbanot because of the shiur. And it's almost as if there's a word missing there, or two words. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Now we're going to get back to something I mentioned earlier. Shiurim ve'onashim halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Okay, shiurim and punishments. Okay, the requisite amounts and punishments are halacha l'Moshe miSinai. They're passed down from Moshe. This is what I told you before. It's kind of like in between a deoraita and a derabanan, a rabbinic and a Torah prohibition. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Two things: requisite amounts and punishments. So the Gemara says, "Onashim nichtav k'tivei." What are you talking about? Punishments are written in the Torah. It says mot yumat, yirgamu b'avanim. All the details are said. All that is in the Torah. That's not a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Said explicitly. Elahachi kama. This is the way you should read it. Shiurim shel onashim halacha l'Moshe miSinai. The requisite amounts in order to get punished. It's not two things: shiurim and onashim. It's shiurim of punishments. The requisite amounts that require you to get a punishment. That's halacha l'Moshe miSinai. And now we're going to prove it from a Braita, and from here we're going to actually see there's another opinion. Tanya nami hachi, shiurim shel onashim halacha l'Moshe miSinai. There you have it. Shiurim of onashim, not shiurim ve'onashim. And achirim omrim, but there's a different opinion, that it was in halacha l'Moshe miSinai, but Beit Dino shel Yabetz tiknum. The Beit Din of Yabetz instituted these. Rashi says Yabetz is Otniel ben Knaz, and that's based on verses from Divrei Hayamim, although in Divrei Hayamim it's not so clear that Yabetz is Otniel ben Knaz, but it seems to be someone from the family of Yehuda. And it says in Divrei Hayamim, I'll just quote you one of the verses, and you'll see why they think it's Yabetz, if it's going to be someone. In Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles 1, chapter 2, verse 55, it says, Umishbechot sofrim yoshvei Yabetz. The families of sofrim were usually, judges or scribes, but scribes may be connected with judges, are from the family of Yabetz, okay, or of the city of Yabetz. And therefore, maybe it was the Beit Din of Yabetz, either it's a place or it's a person. Anyway, they say that court instituted it, meaning it wasn't done by halakha, it wasn't a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, but someone instituted it after. So now the Gemara says, could it really be the Beit Din of Yabetz instituted this? Haktiv ela hamitzvot. Okay, it says these are the mitzvot that Tziva Hashem at Moshe b'nei Yisrael b'Har Sinai, and they darshan she'ein navi rashai l'chadesh davar me'at. No prophet can come and change the law after this, right? It's a big deal that they say prophets can't change laws. They can't come and say, we're instituting something new. How could Yabetz, the Beit Din of Yabetz, have instituted something new? If it says in Navi, now Yabetz, they weren't even a Nevi'im, but they're saying, like any Tanakh character, of course, if they're not even a prophet can't come and say, I'm giving you a new law. Certainly the Beit Din of Yabetz couldn't have done it. And therefore, what must it be? Mean, they forgot them, and then they reinstituted it. In other words, Shiurim or Halakha Moshe B'Sinai were instituted before. Then the laws were forgotten, and his court came in and said, we're going to reinstitute it. Okay? So I forgot to mention, Oniel Ben Knaz was the first judge. Okay, if you're wondering who he is. Kind of said it as if you know, but thank you for reminding me, Gita. Okay, next. Hashotem alolugmav. We're moving along. This was all we were dealing with. Achila being kotevet agassan. Now we're moving on in the Mishnah. The next thing the Mishnah says, when it comes to drinking, it's milolugmav. What exactly that is? It sounds like filling your cheeks. Okay, it sounds like plural, both cheeks. It sounds like cheekfuls. So Allah Yehuda Amar Shmuel, lo milolugmav mamash. Don't take this literally. It doesn't mean cheekfuls, plural, both cheeks. It means ela kol she'ilu yisalkenu letzad echad v'yera'eh kemelolugmav. If I fill up a cheek full of liquid, it's going to look like, right? Imagine my cheek is full. So if one cheek is full, it's going to look like the other cheek is full. You can't kind of fill one cheek without having it look like both your cheeks are full. So one cheek full is enough for you to be liable, okay? And because it looks like both cheeks are full. That's what it means, milolugmav. So Gemara asks the obvious question on Rabbi Yehuda and says, but ha'nantna milolugmav. But the Mishnah says milolugmav, cheeks full, cheek fulls, meaning both cheeks. How could you possibly say it's singular? Ema kimilolugmav. Read the Mishnah differently. It should say kimilolugmav, not milolugmav. Like milolugmav, because it looks like. So now the Gemara says, wait, that sounds nice, but we have a problem with the following source. Metive. Kama yeshevi yechayav. And the Brightet says, how much do you drink in order to be liable in Yom Kippur? We're going to have 4 opinions. Beit Shammai omrim revi'it, a quarter of a load, which is actually more than milolugmav. Beit Hillel omrim milolugmav. Right? Revi'it, by the way, is the usual shiur for drinking. The requisite amount, the standard, is a revi'it, because they say if you were to harden the liquid, you make it into a solid, that would be the size of a kazayit. So kazayit always goes with revi'it. Here it makes sense there would be a different amount, although milolugmav is less than revi'it, which is interesting. Beit Hillel omrim milolugmav. So now you're going to have the problem. If you want to say kimilolugmav, Beit Hillel says milolugmav. Again, the wording doesn't match. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi, I'm not sure if it's Elazar or Eliezer. If somebody wants to check that for me. Kimilolugmav. It's always a problem when it says Resh Aleph. Forgot to check which one it is. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer Kidei Gmi'ah. So I see Rabbi Eliezer. Okay. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says Kidei Gmi'ah, a swallowful. Okay. So you have 4 opinions. Beit Shammai, Revi, Beit Hillel, milolugmav, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera in the name of, Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, kimilolugmav, and Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, Kidei Gmi'ah, a swallow. What, I don't know exactly what that is. It sounds like it's less than milolugmav, 1 swallow's worth. So here you see milolugmav. It doesn't say kimilolugmav, to which the Gemara says, what do you mean? What's the problem? Just like we answered the question on our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said milolugmav. We said it's kimilolugmav. Here also it says milolugmav. It really is kimilolugmav. But you can't really say that here because there were 4 opinions. One was milolugmav, one was kimilolugmav. So again, ihachi hindu Rabbi Eliezer. If you say that it's milolugmav is kimilolugmav, then you're going to have Beit Hillel omrim kimilolugmav. Rabbi Eliezer says kimilolugmav. That can't possibly be. They're listed as 4 separate opinions. They can't be saying the same thing. When you have a Braita listing opinions, they clearly mean different things. You could have 2 people agreeing, but then they wouldn't list them as 2 separate opinions. So, you say, really, both of them mean 1 cheekful. Nobody thinks it's 2 cheekfuls. And you have to assume they must have had a tradition that that's not what it is. Otherwise, I don't know why they wouldn't think that one said that and one said that. But they say it must be, what's the difference? You can have a cheekful that's just barely a cheekful, and you could have a cheekful that's kind of a bigger cheekful. So they basically say, one is exactly and one is a little more than that. And that's the difference between them. The assumption is Rabbi Yehuda says Malo Lugmav goes with the more, but it's a little bit wider. Yeah, thank you, Gita. Like the tefach and Shabbat, right? Where we had the tight tefach and a little bit of a wider tefach. I assume we're going to get to how the whole issue of Malo Lugmav is subjective. My cheek is not the same size as your cheek full, right? That's a whole other issue, which we're going to get into right now. So Mat Kifla Rav Oshai. Imken, wait a minute. There's a whole list in Adiyot of, I think it's an Adiyot, of all the places where Beit Shammai is more stringent than more lenient than Beit Hillel. Usually Beit Hillel is more lenient, Beit Shammai is more stringent, but there's a few exceptions to the rule. Now, if it's Malo Lugmav is only one sheepful, then that's going to be less than a Revi, which means Beit Hillel is more stringent because they say even that small amount, if you drink, you will get karet on Yom Kippur. That's more stringent. So this should be one of the kulas of Beit Shammai, and it's not listed as that. So Amar Le, okay, now remember, the Braita started off with a question. How much would he drink and be chayav? So Beit Hillel isn't always going to be more lenient. It's going to depend on the size of your cheek. So Amar Le, ki itchel, when they asked this question, ba'og melech habashan itchel. They were asking about the classic giant Og Melech HaBashan. He was the king of Bashan, right? He comes up in the Torah. The Jews fight against him. He is a giant. His cheekful is larger than a Revi. So in other words, the point is cheekfuls are subjective. Okay, the requisite amount for drinking is subjective, and it all depends on the size of your cheek. So Beit Hillel isn't necessarily more strict than Beit Shammai because it could be a giant's cheek, which will be greater than a Revi. And presumably when they were asked this question, that's what they were referring to, which is a bit of an extreme answer, hard to imagine, but that's what they say. And therefore, there's a good example of often they come up with any creative explanation in order to answer a question, right? They want to kind of resolve the fact, how could this possibly be? Why is it not in that list? Right? Sometimes they just say they forgot to put this one in. It's not, we've had this question a number of times. Why is this not in that famous list? Because there are other cases, it seems, that aren't listed there. Well, now that we said it's all subjective, we're going to have a whole slew of questions. So here goes. First question. If you're going to say that drinking is Malo Lugmav and dependent on the cheek, your cheek full, the size of your cheek, then why is food the same requisite amount for everybody on Yom Kippur, but drinking is depending on how big your mouth is? So the answer, Amar le Abaye, Kim le Rabbanan b'kikotevet, b'hachimiyat v'date, b'tzir mehachi lo miyatva. The rabbis decided, this is again, the rabbis' connection to requisite amounts, they said, kotevet is across the board. Everybody has what we call yishuv hadat, right? Some sort of satisfaction, that they feel better when they eat a kotevet of food. That's true when it comes to eating. But bishtia, okay, you'd have to do a test, an experiment, and see if this is really true. But bishtia, but when it comes to drinking, it's my cheekful that's going to make me feel satiated. I guess it's this idea, drinks you feel in your mouth a lot, right? It fills up your mouth. So if you drink something that's not really a full cheekful, it doesn't feel like you're drinking very much. But if you drink a cheekful, that already feels like enough, and it depends on your cheekful because it's a matter of feeling and your sensation in your mouth, I guess. So that's what they claim. Now we're going to have another question. Now they're going to question the assumption that a kotevet is the same for everybody. I might feel satiated if I eat a kotevet, but some giant, he's going to have to eat a lot more to feel that feeling of, I shouldn't say satiated, that's sova, but satisfaction, right? In order for him to feel satisfaction, he's going to need to eat more, right? You eat at the table, you know that there's certain people eat a little bit and they're already full, and other people need to eat a lot before they actually feel full. So the same thing with this idea of yishuv hadat, feeling satisfied. So you wouldn't feel that feeling if you're a giant and you eat this small amount of food. It wouldn't mean anything to you. So what does the Gemara answer? In other words, they understand maybe drink is subjective, but food should also be subjective. So now they say, Amar le Abaye, Kim le Rabbanan de b'hachimiyat v'date. The rabbis concluded that this amount causes you to feel, Ruth actually wrote it well, not to feel hungry. Okay. That amount already takes off that curb of you feeling very hungry. And maybe that's a good way to see it. Miu, but here comes the interesting line. Everyone else feels it a lot. Og melech habasham feels it a little. Okay, now what does that mean? So it's a good question what it means. The best explanation I saw was really to say that it'll curb your hunger. For me, it'll curb my hunger maybe for an hour. For Og melech habasham, maybe only for 5 minutes, but at least for 5 minutes, it curbed his hunger, right? He might still need to eat soon after, but it'll take him a little while, right? It will take him somewhat. So therefore, that's what we're going to say. That amount does do something for everybody, even if it's different things for different people. But we're going to still keep asking. If you eat fatty meat, the shiur of a kotevet, I get. But if you eat the shoots from the grapevine, that you're going to eat b'kotevet, right? Imagine you eat salad for lunch, or you eat something with a lot of carbs, right? The carbs are going to fill you up. But the salad, you're going to be hungry. It doesn't usually fill you up, right? We think, oh, let's eat salad, but then you're just starved after. So they say, Amalei Abaye, Kimlu Rabbanit it's going to be the same answer. This amount of kotevet of any food you eat is going to curb the hunger. Miu, however, basar shamein tuva, ulag fanim porta. One will curb your hunger more, and one will curb your hunger less, but it still will curb your hunger somewhat. Matkifla Rab. We still have more questions. Okay, this is one of those classic Gemara, right? Something here just doesn't sit well with them. Now we're moving off the requisite amount. It's the requisite amount within a certain period of time. Normally we say for normal requisite amounts, it's usually a kazayit. And how much do you need to eat within how much amount of time? It's not just a matter of how much you eat. It's a matter of how long did it take you to eat it. If you nibble all day long, a little bit, they don't add up to a shiur for whatever it might be, whether it's something that's forbidden to eat or whether it's how much you need to say a bracha after your meal. All that is dependent on this bichdei achila pras. It's the amount it takes you to eat half a loaf of bread. A pras is either 3 eggs or 4 eggs. So it's the amount of time it takes you to eat 3 or 4 eggs worth of bread, which generally the regular opinion is 9 minutes. Okay, this is, by the way, why we talk about if you eat on Yom Kippur, if you have to eat, let's say, right? There's different ways, we'll get to that. People who need to eat, and upon what's determined they need to eat. In fact, Dr. Michelle this week was all about that, about pregnant women, for example, nursing women. Do you have to fast? How do you fast, etc.? One of the ways to do it, if you know, sometimes you just need to eat and you can eat regular, but if you can avoid that, you do it b'shiurim. You eat a small, like less than a requisite amount within a time span of 9 minutes. Every 9 minutes, you can eat more. Okay, some people say it's 4 minutes, some people say it's more, but the average is 9 minutes, the general psak. So if that's the case, he says, let's do requisite amount, right? It all should be relative. If it's a kazayit within a time frame of k'dei achila pras, and that's the normal time people will eat a kazayit's worth of food, if it's going to be a kotevet, you're going to say a kotevet, which is a larger requisite amount. On Yom Kippur, you're going to use the same achila pras because we assume it takes you longer to eat more food, right? So if kazayit is 9 minutes, maybe kotevet should be 18 minutes, right? If it's, let's say it's double, okay? It's not exactly double, but let's just say. So it should be relative. So again, why do we not change that? Because as I told you, shiurim, we always use k'dei achila pras, even if it's not kazayit. So the Gemara answers, Amalei Abaye, again, Abaye is answering all these questions. The rabbis concluded that when it comes to Yishuv Hadat, feeling this curbing your hunger, it has to be within the 9 minutes. It doesn't matter how much we're talking about eating, it's within the 9 minutes. To which Rabbi asks another question. It should be kazayit, not kotevet. Chatzi pras b'chtei achila pras. Okay, what's chatzi pras? That's a measurement for a strange type of tumah that the rabbis decreed. That if I eat food, a chatzi pras, which is either 1.5 eggs or 2 eggs, depending on whether a pras is 3 eggs or 6 eggs. So I'm sorry, did I say it right? it's 2 eggs or, like I said, I think it's 2 eggs or 4 eggs. I forget exactly, but maybe it's, 3 eggs or 4 eggs. So it would be 1.5 or 2 eggs. So if you eat that amount of food, normally food can't make a person tameh. We talked about that earlier today. But the rabbis decreed that if I'm eating food and I eat it, b'chtei achila pras, I become impure. So that they didn't want me to drink a liquid of truma that would mix in my mouth with the tameh food, and it would make the truma tameh, and I'd end up swallowing tameh truma. It would kind of become tameh in my mouth. So because of that, they made this decree. It's called tumat gvia, that my body can become tameh by eating. So now they say, chatzi pras b'chtei. So when you talk about a chatzi pras, now there's 2 reasons to ask this question. One is a chatzi pras is already a lot more than a kazayin and a kotefet. Number 2, it has nothing to do with Yishuv Hadad. All the while they keep answering, that's when somebody feels this satisfaction, which is relevant to Yom Kippur. When it comes to the Gviyah Tuma, it has nothing to do with feeling satiated, satisfied, and nothing to do with that at all. So therefore, would that also be b'chtei achila pras? Or maybe it would be also, if you eat it within a larger period of time, you'll also become tameh. So Amalei Rav Papa, hanach l'tumat gviyah delav de'oraita. Don't ask a question about tumat gviyah. Of course, we're going to be more lenient and just use the same regular time frame because it's only derabanan. To which the Gemara asks, Papa Haki, did he really say it's derabanan? Because there's a double language of lo titamu behem v'nitmei bam, and you will become tamei. Amar Papa mikancha tumat gviyah de'oraita. He learned from there about this type of tuma, and he says it's de'oraita. To which the Gemara answers, no, don't think that that's a contradiction. The Rav Papa contradicts himself. Midirabanan ukras machta ba'alma. It's really midirabanan. It's just that we connect it to a verse. He doesn't really mean deoraita. It's fascinating because I mean sometimes you say deoraita, you don't really mean deoraita. You mean it has a reference in the Torah, but it's really rabbinic. Okay, right? The most famous is covering your hair, deoraita. The Gemara calls it deoraita, but some people actually say it doesn't mean it's actually Torah law. It's something maybe that was common in the time of the Torah. It comes from the Torah, but anyway, that's a whole other thing. Kola ochalim. Now we're going to finish up with this last section of the Mishnah about how food mixes with other foods to get to the requisite amount. Other things mix with food, drinks mix with drinks, but food and drink don't mix. If you eat meat with the salt on the meat, the salt adds to the requisite amount, and you can get to a requisite amount with the salt and the meat together. Even though you would never call eating salt achila, but because you eat it with the food, since people eat these 2 things together, it counts, it adds up together. The gravy on vegetables counts. So if you eat vegetables with gravy and all together you get to a requisite amount, you're liable. Pshita, isn't that obvious? Why would it? Why would you think otherwise? So you might have thought it's a liquid. Liquids and solids don't mix. Oh no, since it's with food, it's considered food. If you eat while you're already satiated and then you eat more, like you're already full from your meal and then you eat more, that's called achila gasa. This comes up in all sorts of halachot. We've seen it before. When would you have achila gasa in Yom Kippur? So either you could say it just means you eat a sick amount of food, right? Too much. But most people really understand it more so that you're already satiated and then you eat more. So the Magen Avraham says, based on this could only possibly happen on the night of Yom Kippur. You've eaten this big sudat mafseket, Yom Kippur comes in and then you eat more when you're already satisfied. So he claims that that's the only way, because if it's tomorrow, what will happen? Well, to get to excessive consumption, you have to first do regular consumption. You're already going to be liable at that point. So of course, you won't be exempt for you won't be exempt maybe for the extra that you eat, but you're already liable correct for the first part of what you ate. So he claims that it must be at night that we're talking about. So if you eat it, you're exempt. My time, right? If one doesn't afflict oneself, and that's prat lemazik, you're actually destroying your body by eating like that. So that's not considered eating. Likewise, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, in a different context, Amar Rish Lakish, zar she'achal truma achila gasa. If you eat truma and you're not a kohen, you have to pay back the kohen the value, and you have to add a chomesh because you got benefit from it. But if you eat achila gasa, mishalem et hakeren ve'eno mishalem et chomesh. You pay the principal, you don't pay the extra because you didn't benefit. And likewise, right? Ki yochal prat lemazik. It says there, if you eat, which exempts someone who, this isn't called eating, this is called damaging your body. Very interesting halacha. Some people say the reason why you don't have to eat that if you're really not hungry for sudash l'shit, and eating would be achila gasa because you're so full from what you ate, it would actually be forbidden to eat sudash l'shit, right? It's interesting because people always struggle with sudash l'shit. Anyway, it's one of those things. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, last line for today. If you chew on barley grains. So again, it's not enjoyable eating. So yes, you've destroyed the truma, you have to replace it, but you don't have to add the extra fifth. One more thing about this, which we'll see in tomorrow's daf. Have a great day, everyone.